So again, good morning everyone and assalamualaikum. So for this first session, the first session for this morning is about Bangsamoro history. So earlier I was able to provide a a shorter background on why do we need this session. So for today we'll have our former volunteer and also former staff of the Madaris Volunteer Program. I forgot kung saan na siya nagtuturo ngayon. Basta some state college. Josh, ikaw na lang mag-introduce later ng university ninyo. No? So, sige, I'll give you Mr. Joshua Michael Escanio, MVP Volunteer Batch 5. So, it's school year 2019.
19.
Sila yung inabutan ng pandemic. Sige, Josh, I'll give you the floor.
Okay, thank you so much, Sir Rui, for that introduction. So, by the way, I am Joshua Michael C. Escanio, former volunteer from Batch 5, so 2019 to 2020. So, I was assigned before in Tipo-Tipo Basilan. And unfortunately, hindi talaga namin natapos ng maayos yung volunteer service namin because of COVID. So, unexpectedly, kailangan kami pull out by March in order for us na makauwi dahil doon sa mga lockdown na nangyayari. And then, as of now, I am currently connected with Agusan del Sur State College of Agriculture and Technology. So, chartered university na siya ngayon. So, before, staff rin ako ng Madaris Volunteer Program. So, Volunteer Welfare Coordinator ako. So, that's it for my introduction. And then, sorry for turning off my camera. So, maraming dumadaan sa likod ko at sa harap kasi nasa coffee shop ako ngayon. So hindi na ako nakadiretso ng ado kasi medyo kapos na rin ako sa oras. So that's it. And for our first session this morning will be about Bangsamoro history. So a few notes before we begin, since we only have an hour left for our discussion, so we will not be able to discuss the entire subject in details, but as much as possible, we will try to discuss it in a condensed manner. So earlier, Sir Rui mentioned the importance of knowing the Bangsamoro history. And as far as we know, as far as we are concerned, so Bangsamoro history or the history of Mindanao and Sulu in general is something that we don't typically hear in our school, especially in our elementary and high school days, especially in college din, minsan hindi masyadong natatakil ang history ng Mindanao and Sulu, pati na ng Bangsamoro because majority of our textbooks are coming from Luzon and Visayas. So one historian mentioned that hindi naman talaga na pag-iwanan ng Mindanao. It just happened that majority of the writers are from Luzon and Visayas and they are focusing on the histories of Luzon and Visayas. So for today, we will be talking about Bangsamoro history. But before we begin, Rodil, one of the writers that I quoted in this presentation, mentioned that before we tackle the history of Mindanao and Sulu, it would be better to know kung sino ba yung mga tao na nakatira dito sa Mindanao. So who are the people who are inhabiting Mindanao and Sulu? So next slide, please. So according to Rodil, 2003, the people of Mindanao may be divided into two broad categories, so the indigenous and the migrant. So furthermore, Rodil added that the indigenous people may be categorized into two distinct groups, which is indigenous A and indigenous B. So as of now, marami talagang classifications or categories ng mga tao na nakatira sa Mindanao. But for our convenience, we will be using the definition provided to us by Rodil. So according to him, the people of Mindanao can be divided into two categories now, so the indigenous and the migrants. So now, sino ba itong mga indigenous at mga migrants na minention sa atin ni Rodil? So next slide, please. So the indigenous A, which is the Lumad and the Moro. So they were considered as the native inhabitants of Mindanao and Sulu. So historically speaking, according to Rodil, they were the first and the original inhabitants of Mindanao. So sino-sino ba itong mga Lumad at mga Moro na ating minimension ngayon. So next slide please. So the lumad, sino ba 'tong mga lumad? So according to Rudil, the term lumad grew out of the political awakening among various tribes during the martial law regime of Ferdinand Marcos. So basically, the term lumad, which is a shortened term for the Katawang Lumad, was officially adopted by the delegates of the Lumad Mindanao People's Federation or the LMPF founding assembly on June 26, 1986 in Guadalupe Formation Center, Balindog, Kidapawan City. So lumad is a political term which was first formulated during the time of Ferdinand Marcos, but was first accepted as a legal term during the term of Corazon Aquino after the EDSA Revolution. So basically, ang term na lumad is a political term and it is comprised of at least 18 tribes. Well, some would say that there are 50 or more tribes na belong sa lumad, but the original delegates of this federation is only 15 to 18 groups. So the main objective kung bakit merong lumad as a group is for the self-determination within their ancestral domain in accordance to their customary laws and the sovereignty of the republic. So that is the original intention, the original goal kung bakit na-establish ang lumad as a group. So basically, what they want is to have a sense of self-determination in their ancestral domain, which follows their own customary laws, and at the same time, within the bounds and limits of the Philippine Constitution. So ano bang nangyari? Bakit merong mga lumad? So according to history, according to Rodil, the lumad as a group first came during the martial law as a response to the martial law declared by Ferdinand Marcos. So ano ba talagang nangyari doon sa Mindanao? So during that time, a lot of oppression happened in Mindanao. So the indigenous people were at times became victims of different human rights violations, land grabbing, mining, and illegal logging to the point that they decided to band up together and form a political circle kung saan pwede nilang erase ang kanilang concern, which is self-determination. So next slide, please. And the Lumad subgroup is composed of 18 major ethno-linguistic groups scattered across Mindanao, while some historians would mention that there are at least 50 or more different ethno-linguistic groups that belongs to the Lumad subgroup, but the problem is that hindi pa siya na-acknowledge. But the government acknowledges these 18 different ethno-linguistic groups. So sino ba sila? So they are the Bagobo, Banwaon, Dablaan, the Bukidnon, the Babawon, Higaonon, Mamanwa, Mandaya, Manguwangan, Manobo, Mansaka, Matigsalug, Subanon, Tagakaolo, Talaandig, Tiboli, Teduray, and Lobo. So next slide please. And the next group that we will discuss and sila yung magiging focus natin for this presentation this morning would be the Moro. So the term first, no, before trying to understand who are the Moros. So the term Moro was first coined by our Spanish colonizer. So bakit Moro ba ang tawag nila sa mga Muslim dito sa Pilipinas? So prior to the colonization of the Philippines, the Spaniards are also busy fighting Muslim communities in North Africa and even in Europe. So during that time, ang tawag ng mga Spanish doon sa mga Muslim sa North Africa and then sa Spain are Moors. So when they came to the Philippines in 1521, so they discovered that there is already a presence of Muslim communities in Mindanao. So they brought with them the term Moros to describe the Muslims living in the Philippines. However, the term Moro has a pejorative connotation. Bakit may negative connotation siya? Because the Spaniards, especially in the writings of of different Spanish chroniclers would mention that the Moros are savages, they are barbaric, they are backward, so on and so forth. So as time passes by, the term Moro is equated with these negative connotations. However, the term Moro was first accepted by the Muslim community in 1972 when the Moro National Liberation Front leader adopted the term. In other words, yes, the term Moro has a pejorative connotation. However, as time passes by, especially during the adoption of the MNLF, the term Moro or the word Moro acquired a new meaning or dimension. So ano ba yung bagong meaning na nakuha or na-associate with the term Moro? Next slide, please. So according to Abu Rasad Asani, one of the prominent officers or leaders of the Moro National Liberation Front, in his piece, Moros Not Filipinos, he mentioned, originally, the use of the term Moro by the colonialist was meant to perpetuate an image of the Muslim people of Mindanao, Basilan, Sulu, and Palawan as savage and treacherous, while they are simply daring and tenacious in the defense of their homeland and faith. But despite its colonial origins, the Moro National Liberation Front has cleansed the term of its unpleasant connotation by propagating the more correct view that the tenacity with which the natives conducted their war of resistance against foreign intrusion was a classic exercise of heroism. So basically, the negative connotation of the word Moro was replaced by the spirit of heroism, the spirit of courage, the spirit of fighting for self-determination for their homeland. So kung dati, meron pang negative connotations ng term na Moro, but as time passes by during the adoption of the MNLF, napalitan or na-cleanse pa ang meaning ng word or ng term na Moro. However, it cannot be denied that even up to this day, even today as we speak, there are still negative connotations or negative meanings or negative words associated with the term Moro. And as MVP ambassadors, as MVP volunteers, it is our task also to help the Moros or to help the Muslim communities spread the other or the renewed meaning or definition of the term Moro. So, sino-sino ba itong mga Moro? Or sino-sino ba? Or ano-ano ba ang mga tribes belonging to the Moro subgroup? So, next slide, please. So, the Moro subgroup is composed of 13 different ethno-linguistic groups. However, there are also some historians who claim that there are 12, others would say there are 14, some would say there are 15, so on and so forth. Different ethno-linguistic groups scattered across mainland Mindanao, the Sulu Archipelago, and Palawan. So sino-sino ba sila? So they are the Iranon, the Jamamapon, the Palawani, Mulbog, Calagan or Kagan, the Kalibugan, Maguindanao or the Maguindanon, the Maranao, Sama, Sangil or Sangil, Tausug, Badjao, and Yakan. So next slide, please. So kung nakita ninyo, I highlighted the term Sama and Badjao. Bakit? So earlier I mentioned that there are 13 different ethno-linguistic groups, no, na kasama or nag-compose sa Moro subgroup. However, some of the historians or the people from the academy would say that the Sama and the Badjao belongs to the same group. So up until now, there is a contention kung saan ba talaga na belong ang mga Badjao. Are they a separate tribe or are they a member of the Sama tribe? So one historian would say that the term Badjao is politically incorrect. Bakit siya politically incorrect? So number one, he mentioned that the term Badjao has a negative meaning. Bakit? Even as kahit tayo, when we mention the word Badjao, there are several things na lalabas sa ating isipan. No? And during my classes doon sa bago kong workplace, I ask my students, no, when you hear the word Badjao, ano ba yung unang pumapasok sa isip ninyo? So, the very first thing, no, majority ng mga students who would say that when they remember or when they mention the word badyaw, una talagang papasok sa kanilang isipan is that they are beggars, that they are dirty, they are very unhygienic, so on and so forth. So basically, when you talk about the word badyaw, meron talaga siyang negative connotation. And for some scholars, they would say that it's incorrect, hindi siya pwede. And number two, it is politically incorrect because according to some, the culture, the traditions, the practices, and even the language being used by the Bajau are very similar to those of the Sama. So bakit ba nagkaroon ng distinction? Bakit ba i-separate itong mga Bajau? Because ba dahil unhygienic? Because ba sa ibang mga factors in the community? Well, some of the more conservative Muslim communities would say that the Bajau is a separate entity because they are not strictly practicing Islam. Because some of our Bajau brothers and sisters are still practicing what we call ancestor worship. So aside from Allah, they also have ancestors or spirits na kanilang gina-worship up until now. And because of that ancestor and spirit worship, according to them, yan ang isa sa mga rason bakit hindi mag-qualify as Sama or as Moro in general ang mga Bajau. So indeed, kailangan talagang i-refine kung ano ba talaga ang position ng mga Bajau within the community. So that is the one side. No? So politically incorrect siya. And what some of the historians would say is, i-separate talaga yung mga Bajau. However, there are also some historians would say nga, yes, ang mga Bajau is one with the Sama. So yun ang isang position, di ba? So the Bajau should be considered as part of the Sama. While some would say that the Bajau should remain a separate entity from the Sama. So dapat separate entity siya because, well, I mentioned earlier, hindi sila nag-practice ng Islam in the strict sense. However, some would say na okay lang ito. Some would say na okay lang ito. However, ang kanilang problema is that, yes, okay lang sa amin na we should be separated from the Sama group, but the term Bajau should be cleansed of its negative connotation. So okay lang sa kanila na gamitin ng term na Bajau so long as it is cleansed with its negative connotation. So very problematic, very diverse. It's really hard to classify kung ano ba talaga ang standing ng mga Bajau ngayon sa community, especially in the Bangsamoro region. So next slide please. So yun siya ha. For the indigenous A, we have the Moro and the Lumad. So accordingly, they are the original inhabitants of Mindanao and Sulu. So ngayon, we have the indigenous B. So the Visayan-speaking indigenous people of Mindanao. So this group comprised of the Visayan-speaking indigenous people of northern and eastern Mindanao. Usually naka-situate sila doon sa Misamis area by bandang Cagayan up until Iligan City. And of course, the Chavacanos of Zamboanga. So bakit ba sila gi-term as indigenous B? So according to Rudil, it is no longer easy to identify them because they have assimilated into the migrant Visayan population, which now compose the majority of the place. Yes, they are in an indigenous groups living in Mindanao. However, as time passes by, dahil na rin sa influx of Visayan settlers in Mindanao, historians and even anthropologists are having a hard time distinguishing these indigenous groups. And also the Chapaganos in Zamboanga, they've been in Mindanao only during the Spanish occupation. So the Chapaganos are Spanish soldiers from Ternate, somewhere in Indonesia or Malaysia. They were recruited by the Spaniards. And after their service in the military, some of them stayed in Cavite while some decided to stay in Zamboanga. So sa dahan-dahan, sa hinay-hinay, they were assimilated into the native population. So yun ang indigenous A and indigenous B. Now let's go to the second major group of inhabitants in Mindanao. So next slide, please. So we have the migrants. So the migrants, so they constitute at least the majority of the population in Mindanao. So bakit merong mga migrants? So by 20th century, especially after the Second World War, so migration from Luzon and Visayas to Mindanao was encouraged and sponsored by the government. So basically, Mindanao, which was termed as a land of promise, was very appealing to the people of Luzon and Visayas. So basically, the migrants are the people coming from Luzon and Visayas. So basically, kasali kami dito. Ako, si Kim na nandito rin, si Rui. Most of the staff of the MVP are migrants coming from Luzon and Visayas who decided to stay here in Mindanao in search of a mission in life and of course, our source of livelihood. So basically, the migrants, kung sino pa yung mga migrants na according to Rodil, supposedly konti lang dapat ang mag-migrate dito sa Mindanao and Sulu. But the land is very promising. The land is very rich in resources. Minsan lang tayo tinatamaan ng bagyo at kahit ano pang mga natural disasters. So it is very enticing talaga sa people of Luzon and Visayas na lumipat, no, from Luzon and Visayas to Mindanao. So next slide, please. So let's go now to the advent of Islam. So earlier, we mentioned about the different groups of people living in Mindanao. So bakit ba mahalaga na malaman natin kung sino yung nakatira sa Mindanao? Because as history unfolds, these three groups, these three people are the main players in the history of Mindanao and Sulu, especially in the Bangsamoro. So we have to know kung sino ba talaga yung mga nakatira dito sa Mindanao in order for us to have a deeper understanding of the history of the Bangsamoro. So now let's go to the advent of Islam. So basically, unlike Christianity who came here in the Philippines with the use of arms, Islam came to the Philippines with trade. It's a much more peaceful way of propagating a world religion. So prior to the Spanish colonialization, there are already trade routes existing between Mindanao and other maritime countries and cities across Asia and Africa. So by 1480, Sharif Karim ul Makdum arrived in the Philippines. So some historians would say na siya talaga yung pinakauna na Muslim na dumating dito sa Pilipinas. However, some of the Tarsilas in Tawi-Tawi would suggest that prior to the coming of Makdum, there is this certain Tuan Mashayka who came to the Philippines as early as 1280. So, meron pa daw nauna kay Makdum, but historians would agree that Makdum would be the first Muslim to come in the Philippines and spread Islam. So it is also Makdum that built the first mosque in Simunul, Tawi-Tawi. So next slide, please. So to better understand the coming of Islam in the Philippines, we have to understand first the trade routes in Asia. So first, from Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of Islam, so the missionaries together with the traders, dumaan talaga sila in a land route, overland route from Saudi Arabia to India for trade and of course for the propagation of Islam. And from India, they managed to take a sea route from India to the different islands across Southeast Asia, first in Indonesia and then Malaysia before coming to the Philippines. So that is the movement of Islam from Saudi Arabia to Southeast Asia, especially in the Philippines. So next slide, please. So since there is already an existing Islamic presence in the Philippines, so it cannot be denied that the practice of Islam also affected the way the politics was conducted in Mindanao and Sulu. So as early as 14th century, there are already existing sultanates in Mindanao and Sulu. And the presence of the different sultanates in Mindanao and Sulu would debunk the idea being taught to us before that the Spaniards are the ones who introduced civilization, that the Spaniards are the ones who introduced the system or the concept of centralized government in the Philippines. Whereas prior to the coming of the Spaniards, there are already existing centralized governments in Mindanao and Sulu in the face of the sultanates, which have a number one, diplomatic relations with other countries and cities in Asia and Africa. Number two, existing trade and other kinds of foreign relations din sa ibang lugar. So basically, before the coming of the Spaniards in the Philippines, meron na talagang centralized governments here in Mindanao and Sulu. So the first one is the Sultanate of Sulu. So it is founded by Sharif ul Hashim, so Hisham in some accounts on November 17, 1405, some would say in 1457. So it quickly rose to become a maritime power with close ties to the greater Muslim community in Mindanao and the Kingdom of Borneo. In other words, the Sultanate of Sulu has an existing trade and diplomatic relations with different areas in Mindanao and even in Asia. So the Sultanate of Sulu also maintained a strong tributary relationship with China, and by 1768, it became a center of trade network extending from other parts of Mindanao, Palawan, Borneo, and other foreign countries in Asia. So basically, the Sultanate of Sulu was deemed to be one of the strongest sultanates that ever existed in Mindanao prior to Spanish colonialization. So next slide, please. So we also have the Sultanate of Maguindanao. So prior to the founding of the Sultanate, the Yuan dynasty annals mentioned that there is a polity known as Wenduling, no? Doon talaga sa Mindanao, and then the polity Wenduling was replaced by a sultanate known as the Sultanate of Maguindanao. So Islamization process was made by Sharif Kabungsuan, who preached Islam in the area around 15th century. So one of the greatest sultans of Maguindanao, yung pinaka-well-known talaga na sultan, was Sultan Kudarat, who defended his land against the Spanish colonizers. And it is also interesting to note, no, in the Sultanate of Maguindanao that the Chinese have a lasting impressions in Maguindanao culture, as Chinese gongs, yellow as the color of royalty, and Chinese idioms entered Maguindanao culture. And if you have the chance to visit Maguindanao, especially in Datupiang, you would also see a Chinese cemetery existing there. And also some accounts would say that Datupiang is in fact a Chinese descendant. Next slide, please. So last, the Confederate States of Lanao. So pata pangampong sa Lanao. So it refers to a collective term for the four states named Bayabao, Masui, Unayan, and Balui, which comprise the Lanao Sultanate. So prior to the invasion of the Sultanate of Maguindanao, these areas existed as a separate country known as Maluuno, which according to the Chinese chronicler Zhu Haizi, is located southeast of Zamboanga City. So just like Maguindanao, Lanao before, or the Confederate States of Lanao, used to be a Chinese polity. But as time passes by, especially with the conquest of the Sultanate of Maguindanao, So Lanao became an Islamic area, and as time passes by, they decided to separate themselves from the Sultanate of Maguindanao. So it is by 1616 that the lords of Bayabao, Balawi, Masuwi, and seceded from the Maguindanao Sultanate. So next slide, please. So here you can see the map of Mindanao and Sulu during the Spanish colonial period. So as you can see, majority sa areas dati ng Mindanao and Sulu are not conquered by the Spaniards. So malaking chunk talaga ng Mindanao dati ang hindi pa napasok ng mga Kastila. So the Spanish colonial process is centered mostly on the coastal areas, particularly sa East Coast, ng Davao Oriental to Surigao to Misamis in the north, and then sa Zamboanga City, Lamitan, Isabela de Basilan, and also in Davao City. And it is also good to note that the Sultanate of Sulu was able to maintain its independence or autonomy during the Spanish colonialization. So medyo malaki rin ang area ng Sulu before. And then we can also see the areas belonging to the Sultanate of Sulu and the Confederation of the Sultanates of Lanao. So the red ones are the lands or the areas occupied by the Spanish, and then the blue ones are from the Sultanate of Sulu, the green ones, the Confederation of the Sulu Sultanates, Lanao Sultanates, and then the orange one would be the Sultanate of Maguindanao. So let us remember, based on the existence of the different sultanates in Mindanao and Sulu, that the Muslims were able to fend off the different invasions or attacks made by the Spaniards and even by the Americans during the colonialization period. So later on, we will be able to understand bakit majority of the people of Mindanao, especially in the Bangsamoro, would claim that Mindanao, Sulu, and even Palawan should maintain independence from the Philippines. So malalaman natin sa takbo ng kasaysayan that yes, these sultanates and even some of the tribal groups in Mindanao and Sulu as well as Palawan were able to maintain their independence from the invaders, which according to them is a perfect springboard for the assumption, for the claim that Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan should be a separate, independent country. So next slide, please. So the colonial period from 1565 to 1946. However, some historians would argue that the colonial period or the colonization of Mindanao is still happening up until today. Bakit? As mentioned earlier, some historians, some people from the academe, some people from the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao would maintain that Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan is a separate entity. That the Republic of the Philippines is continuously colonizing Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan up until today. So next slide, please. So our first colonizers, the Spanish Empire. So before we talk about the Spanish intervention in Mindanao and Sulu, it is good to note that when Magellan first came to the Philippines, according to Rodin and Gaspar, they mentioned that the idea of spreading Christianity in the Philippines is not is not is not a major priority of the Spaniards. So hindi talaga naging priority ng mga Spaniards or even part of the plan to spread Christianity in the Philippines during their colonial period. Bakit? If you can remember, sa elementary and high school days natin, ang tinuturo sa atin na history would be coming from Gregorio F. Zaide, di ba, yung Philippine history niya. And according to Zaide, the Spaniards came to the Philippines for three reasons. Yun yung tinatawag niya na 3 Gs. So God, gold, and glory. However, Rodil and Gaspar debunked the claim, citing that in the orders received by Magellan, the spread of Christianity was not mentioned. Ang na-mention lang doon sa mission ni Magellan was that they go to uh, Southeast Asia, particularly sa Indonesia, and then to some extent to Philippines, to gather spices and territories, period. So yun lang talaga ang naging motivation ng mission ni Magellan. So bakit mahalaga ito? Bakit mahalaga na malaman natin kung ano talaga yung intention ni Magellan and then Legazpi in conquering the Philippines? So number one, mahalagang malaman natin kasi there is a misconception that the Spaniards came to the Philippines to evangelize. So yun talaga yung nasa isip natin, that the Spaniards came to the Philippines to evangelize. However, what happened, according to Rodin and to Gaspar, is that colonization happened using Christianity. So Christianity was used as a tool by the colonizers to spread their mission, to enact their mission, to gather more lands, to gather more gold in the Philippines. So iba talaga yung claim before na pumunta ang mga Spaniards for the sake of evangelization. Whereas yung sinabi natin kanina that the Spaniards came to the Philippines for the sole purpose of colonization, and they used Christianity to execute the colonization process. Now, Mindanao. So the Spaniards launched a series of attacks against the Moros in Mindanao and Sulu in the attempt to subjugate the region. In return, the Moros also continuously raided Spanish settlements as far as Manila. So the battle between the Spaniards and the Moros lasted for 333 years, from 1565 up until 1898. So for the Spaniards, the Moros pose a threat to their Catholic mission in the Philippines. That is why, as much as possible, they want to subjugate the Moros in Mindanao because they see it as a threat against their Catholic faith. So yan talaga ang isa sa mission ng mga Spaniards why they came to Mindanao. In Mindanao. They want to subjugate the Muslims because according to them, they are a hindrance to their Catholic faith. However, Rodin also mentioned that the idea of threat to Catholicism is only a facade to their original mission of conquering Mindanao for the sake of economic and political gains only. So aside from the proposed evangelization process and land-grabbing activities, ang isa din sa naka-fuel ng galit ng mga Muslim against the Spaniards is that the Spaniards are continuously disrespecting the Moro culture, and ito, the desecration of Moro graveyards. Bakit nila i-desecrate ang graveyard sa mga Moro, particularly ng mga sultan at mga dato? Because the Spaniards thought that there are treasures buried together with the sultans and datus in Mindanao and Sulu. So the desecration of the dead, especially sa kanilang leaders, fueled a sense of anger by the Moros against the Spaniards, especially those Spaniards living in Manila. So that is the relationship, that is the conflict, that is the situation, the setting, the context between the Moros and the Spaniards in the next 333 years of Spanish occupation in the Philippines. Next slide, please. So by the end of the Spanish occupation of the Philippines, the Spanish were not able to conquer the entirety of Mindanao and Sulu, but were able to submit the Sultanate of Sulu into a protectorate status. So sa 333 years of war between the Moros and the Spaniards, wala talaga nila nakuha ang buong Mindanao, especially the lands in the Bangsamoro region. Bakit? The Muslims were able to fend off the invading Spaniards. But because this is a war, it would cost them money. It would cost them manpower to the point that umabot sa stalemate ang Spaniards and then ang Moros. And the agreement between the two, kasi very costly talaga yung gera in terms of human life and then economic resources. So the agreement between the two, this was known as the Treaty of Peace, no, not Paris. The Treaty of Peace is that yes, the Spaniards would acknowledge Muslim autonomy, but the Moros would allow the Spaniards to establish garrisons or camps within the Sultanate of Sulu, Maguindanao, and Lanao. So basically, these three sultanates entered into a treaty with the Spaniards and made them into different protectorate states. Protectorate states in the sense that these sultanates will be able to maintain their autonomy, however, with the protection, with the guidance, with the aid of the Spanish Empire. So the protectorate status defined the relationship between the Spanish Empire and the three sultanates. And mahalaga na malaman natin kung ano yung relationship natin or relationship ng tatlong sultanates na ito with Spain because it will be very crucial with the next treaty between the Spanish and the Americans. That would be the Treaty of Paris. So going back, the kind of relationship that these three sultanates have with the Spanish Empire should be termed as should be termed as suzerainty and not sovereignty. So protectorate ang status ng relationship between Spain and these sultanates. So next slide please. So here we are now in the Treaty of Paris. So bakit ba nagkaroon ng Treaty of Paris? So by 1898, during the Philippine Revolution, that was also the time that the Spanish-American War broke out. And since the Philippines is a Spanish colony, the Americans came to the Philippines, aiding the Filipinos in overthrowing the Spanish government. However, as history would tell us, there would be a separate treaty between the Americans and the Spaniards without the knowledge of the Filipinos na binenta na pala tayo ng mga Kastila doon sa mga Amerikano. And that would be known as the Treaty of Paris. So on December 10, 1898, the Americans and the Spaniards signed the Treaty of Paris. So doon sa treaty, Spain relinquished its claim over the Philippines to the Americans for the sum of 20 million US dollars. And then, in the treaty itself, the cessation of the Philippines would include the three sultanates of Sulu, Maguindanao, and Lanao. However, it became problematic later on. Bakit? As mentioned earlier, these three sultanates does not accept the sovereignty of Spain, only the protectorate status. In other words, these three sultanates were able to maintain their autonomy. So they asked, bakit sila kasali? Bakit sila kasali na wala man talagang full control ang Spain sa kanila? But the Spaniards were already evacuating the Philippines. Wala na silang magawa about that. What they did is that they asked the Americans for additional 100,000 US dollars for the sale of these three sultanates. In other words, yes, they maintained that protectorate status. However, the Spaniards sold these three sultanates for the additional sum of 100,000 US dollars. So basically, hindi talaga kasama yung tatlong sultanate na iyon and the rest of Mindanao in the Treaty of Paris. Hindi talaga ito kasali sa ibinenta ng Spain doon sa Amerika. What happened is that Spaniards asked additional money from the Americans for the sale of these three sultanates. So that is the one thing that was the negative thing that happened during the Treaty of Paris. So sa dahan-dahan, Mindanao and Sulu, especially the three sultanates, are slowly being assimilated to the whole Philippine nation, which will be deemed constitutional or maging isang country na by 1946. So next slide, please. So the American occupation. So after the Treaty of Paris, the Americans began to occupy the Philippines, especially Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan. So when the Americans came to Mindanao, they talked to the Sultan of Sulu. Kinausap talaga nila yung Sultan ng Sulu kung bakit ayaw nilang magpa-sali doon sa bagong province ng Amerika, which is the Philippine province during that time. So, the Sultan maintained that the relationship with Spain was a protectorate one. So, they were able to maintain their autonomy. So, what the Americans did in order to, para hindi pa sila mas mahirapan in terms of war, because during that time, 1899, the Americans are already at war with the Filipinos in the north. So ongoing pa rin yung Filipino-American war. So in order for them to have a focus on Luzon, so the Americans made or initiated the Bates Treaty. So the Bates Treaty prevented the Moros from participating in the Philippine-American War, with the Americans only have to concentrate their forces in the north. So wala talagang gulo muna sa Mindanao at that time. In the treaty, it is stipulated that the Americans would, number one, acknowledge the sovereignty of Sulu. Number two, they would not sell Sulu and its islands to other foreign powers. And number three, they would be able to maintain their autonomy and practice their culture, religion, and belief. And number four, the sultans of Sulu would receive a monthly allowance from the Americans. Ano ba ang exchange nito? So, given na yung mga privilege na yon, in exchange for American garrisons to be constructed in Sulu and other places in Mindanao. So that was the content of the Bates Treaty. However, the Bates Treaty, which was used after the American occupation of the Philippines in 1946 as a basis na hindi dapat isali sa Philippine Republic ang Mindanao and Sulu kasi mayroong separate na kasunduan ng mga Amerikano at ang mga tao sa Sulu. However, the treaty was not acknowledged, saying that the U.S. Congress did not authorize the said treaty. In other words, it is just an agreement between the American officer during that time and the Sultan of Sulu. It was not an agreement made between the Sultan of Sulu and the U.S. government. In short, null and void ang Bates Treaty. So during the Bates Treaty, so the Americans were able to concentrate in the north, di ba? So after the defeat of Aguinaldo and some of the revolutionaries in Luzon and Visayas, they gave their full attention to Mindanao. So the Americans, in the hope to assimilate Sulu, Mindanao, and Palawan to the whole of the Philippines, tried to pacify Mindanao and Sulu. So next slide, please. So the pacification process. So in 1903, the Americans legally established the Moro province, which included the Muslim-dominated territories of Mindanao and Sulu, and was administered by an American commander. So the establishment of the province received mixed emotion within the Muslim community. So bakit nagkaroon ng mixed emotions? Some of the Muslims would maintain that they should fight for their autonomy, for their full and complete autonomy, while other Muslims would say that the presence of the Americans would benefit the region in terms of economic and infrastructure growth. So there is a sense of confusion among different Muslim communities during that time. However, Abinales mentioned that the confusion created by the Americans was actually a strategy of the Americans. So the oldest in the book, divide and conquer. So the US effectively created alliances with different datus, with different sultans, and then pacified the remaining opposition. So the possibility of a united Muslim opposition against the Americans was not realized because of this strategy by the Americans. So they suppressed and they accommodate. So suppression in terms of eliminating the opposition, and accommodation in the sense of befriending the different datus and sultans in Mindanao. So next slide, please. So, ano ba yung implication ng American occupation in Mindanao and Sulu? So the Americans reframed the committed massacres in support of their pacification process. So they framed the idea that the Moro is the ideal colonized subject, no? Which erased violence and replaced it with heroic actions. In other words, the Americans were able to justify their presence, were able to justify their violence in Mindanao and Sulu, since, according to them, it is their moral obligation to what? To civilize the Moro people. So their action, their colonization in the Philippines was made legal, was made correct because of this framework. So the US military changed the narrative of the US brutality in support of their colonial project. No? So they reframed US violence against the Moros by saying that their goal of their pacification process in Mindanao was actually not to subjugate the Moros, but to develop the Moros' potential within their superior cultures or the superior American culture. In other words, ang presence daw ng mga Amerikano sa Sulu and Mindanao was in fact a positive one. So dyan nag-start na bago yung kasaysayan ng Mindanao and Sulu in favor of the American conquerors. So basically, the Americans were able to justify their conquest of Mindanao and Sulu. So next slide, please. The good side of the American occupation of the Philippines is that they are more respectful towards the Moros compared to other non-Christian tribes of the Philippines. So that was the bias of the Americans, no? Mas nirespeto nila ang mga Muslim before compared to other tribes in Mindanao. Bakit? According to the Americans, yes, backward, quote unquote, backward ang mga Muslims, but they have two qualities that qualified them to become, quote unquote, a little bit of civilized. So number one, there is a presence of world religion among the Moro people, which is Islam. And number two, there is the presence of aristocracy among the Muslim communities in the area. So those two, according to the Americans, would in a way qualify the Moros to be a little bit of civilized compared to their non-Christian counterparts in Mindanao. So as a consequence of this attitude, Makina mentioned that the American colonizers tend to conglomerate various Moro ethno-linguistic groups under a single label, Moro, rather than focusing on the tribal divisions among them. So Abinales would also mention that one of the good things that the Americans brought in Mindanao and Sulu is that they were the ones who first initiated a sense of nationalism among the different Moro tribes in Mindanao. So before, a sense of tribal differences are strong among the Muslim communities, but with the presence of the American, yung attitude nila towards the Moros would help them shape a sense of Moro nationalism, which would be very helpful, especially in their struggle against the Philippine government. And also, the Americans were able to monitor well the Moros compared to the non-Christians in Mindanao simply because majority of the Moros are lowlanders, meaning yung ibang mga tribo dito sa Mindanao usually nakatira sila sa bundok. So since the Moros are in the lowlands, sa kapatagan sila at sa mga dagat, mas ma-monitor sila ng mga Amerikano to the point that they were able to tax the Moros. So taxation and land registration, ang downside dito, medyo nawala ang maraming traditional Muslim land na nawala, but the good side according to Abinales is that they were able to create different infrastructures in Muslim Mindanao. So in a way, may negative and positive effects ang presence ng mga Amerikano sa Mindanao and Sulu. So next slide please. So post-war to martial law period. So earlier, that was the highlights of the colonial process in Mindanao and Sulu. So after the Americans, World War II, so na-stop lahat ng mga efforts to separate Mindanao and Sulu because the Muslims during that time helped in the struggle against the Japanese Imperial Army. So the process of self-determination, the process of attaining autonomy resumed after World War II. So post-war to martial law period from 1946 to 1986. So what happened? Next slide, please. So before we begin, by June 4, by July 4, 1946, finally, America granted independence to the Philippines. However, very abrupt ang pag-grant ng independence ng Amerika sa Philippines. Bakit? That was the closing of World War II. Bakit significant yung closing ng World War II sa pag-grant ng independence ng US sa Philippines? Since the Philippines is an American colony, so the Americans have the responsibility of rebuilding the Philippines from war. Since responsibility tayo nila. However, by granting the Philippines its independence, the Filipinos would be the one responsible for building our nation. So in a way, wala nang responsibility ang Amerika in rebuilding the Philippines after World War II. So that was a very strategic move by the US na i-grant ang independence ng Philippines as early as 1946, just a year after the end of World War II. So in a way, we are left on our own, and the Americans, in a way, were able to maintain their colonial presence because the Philippines would not be able to stand its own. And since we are an independent country, we have nothing to do but once again rely to American help in rebuilding the country. So basically, that is also a strategy of the Americans to maintain a close and deep connection with the Philippines. So that was the birth of neo-colonialism. So internal migration. So this happened after World War II. So Makina also mentioned that after the war, there was a tremendous expansion of government-sponsored Christian Filipinos from the northern province to the Muslim south. In other words, the Philippine government sponsored people from Luzon and Visayas na mag-transfer dito sa Mindanao. And grabe yung naging migration na nangyari. So one example would be in the municipality of Kapatagan sa Lanao del Norte. So in 1918, there were only 24 Christian settlers in the area. So 24 lang. So in 1941, the number jumped to 8,000. Laki ng tinubo. So by 1960s, the number rose to 93,000. So vastly outnumbering the 7,000 Muslim inhabitants in the area. And the same setting is not only true to Kapatagan, but to other areas in the Bangsamoro region. Not only in the Bangsamoro region, but in Mindanao in general. Grabe yung naging migration process to the point of minoritizing the inhabitants of Sulu and Mindanao. That would affect our, not our kasi migrant tayo, that would affect the indigenous peoples, both the Lumad and the Moros, participation in politics, economic growth, and development in the island. So furthermore, because of the migration that happened, no, there was a growing economic and agrarian disparity between the benefits received by the Christian settlers compared to the original Muslim and Lumad inhabitants. So since these settlers are sponsored by the government, they are the ones being favored by the government. So what happened? According to Abenales, no, in his observation of the communities during the migration period, no, so majority of the government sponsored infrastructure projects were focused only on the Christian settlements to the point that the Muslims received nothing. According to him, mas may natatanggap pa yung mga Muslim inhabitants during the American occupation compared to the aid given by the Philippine government. And number two, since the Muslims have no idea or sometimes konti lang yung idea nila about land registration, the migrants benefited from it. So the migrants took this an opportunity to buy these lands from the Moros and the Lumad in exchange for a small amount of money or sometimes goods pagani, no? So, well, family story. So my grandfather was also a migrant, no? So he first came to Agusan del Sur by 1960, so 1970. So, well, in a way, medyo land grabber siya kasi he was able to buy at least 30 to 40 hectares of land during that time in exchange only for cigarettes and ukay-ukay. So, yun. Yun ang family history namin, but hindi na yun siya ma-erase, but that was the reality before. So, it is true not only to my family, but also to other migrants who settled in Mindanao. So basically, the Moros, the Lumad, who should be the original inhabitants of Mindanao and Sulu, were in the process minoritized by the migrants. Next slide, please. Next slide. So along the way, in the process of migration, there were also troubles brewing. So nagkakaroon na ng gulo sa Mindanao. And the Philippine Congress, alarmed by these rising cases of Muslim quote-unquote banditry in Mindanao and Sulu, opened an investigation on the causes of unrest and disparity. So the committee, biased as it is, adopted the colonial discourse of Muslim backwardness. So that was the springboard of the investigation, and concluded that poverty in Muslim communities was because of the Muslim culture. So sa may nahitabo, ano ba ang nangyari? The migration by the people of Luzon and Visayas to Mindanao and the unfair treatment between these two groups was not included in the equation. Hindi naging factor during the investigation ng migration na nangyari. Hindi naging factor sa investigation na nangyaring unfair distribution of, well, government services between the migrants and the Moros. The report concluded that poverty in this area was because of the Muslim culture. Simple as that. And as a result, the government established the CNI, or the Commission on National Integration, and gave scholarship to Muslim Filipinos in the hope of integrating them into the Republic of the Philippines. So nakita na solution ng Philippine Congress is that, yes, the Muslim culture is thought to be backward, so why not integrate the Muslim people in the Philippine Republic? So, in a way, na-feel ng Philippine government that they have the responsibility to educate, to assimilate the Muslim population in the country, in the Philippine Republic. So in the process of assimilation, isa sa nakita na avenue ng CNI or the Commission on National Integration is that they provide scholarships to young Muslim students. So magbigay sila ng scholarships, so these Muslim students will be sent to Luzon to be educated. So in the process, they will know what are the dealings, what are the experiences of the people of Luzon. So they are hoping that when these students would return to Mindanao, they would encourage the Muslim population to be assimilated in the island. And also in the process, plant a sense of ideology to the Muslims na mas better na kung magpa-assimilate tayo sa Philippine Republic than to maintain our own autonomy. So what happened in the process? Next slide, please. So these students who were sent to Manila under the CNI scholarship program experienced what are the biases by the majority of the Filipinos against the Muslims. So nakita nila ito in Manila. Nakita nila that during the time of Ferdinand Marcos, there were several massacres committed against the Muslims, and also the Jabida massacre. Well, the Jabida massacre happened in Corregidor. So in a nutshell, Marcos wanted to invade Sabah, Malaysia, but he cannot do so because of international pressure. So what he planned is that he trained Muslim soldiers to conduct guerrilla warfare in Sabah. And if meron ng unrest doon sa Malaysia, so Philippines would intervene. So when these soldiers knew that they will be sent to Sabah to fight their fellow Muslims, so these soldiers mutinied. So parang walang lalabas na balita about the proposed invasion. So these soldiers were massacred in Corregidor. Fortunately, there were survivors who were able to tell the tale of the Jabida massacre. So in 1968, the CNI scholarship unintentionally created a group of young Muslim intellectuals schooled in political activism and able to articulate the frustrations both of Muslim students disaffected by their encounters of Christian hegemony in Manila and of the peripheralized Muslims in general. So ideally, CNI's goal was to educate, was to brainwash these Muslim students, but these Muslim students were able to be awakened and they were able to see the realities happening in the Bangsamoro region, especially sa ano ang treatment ng mga majority of the Filipinos against the Muslims. So ano yung grupo na nabuo during that time. Next slide, please. So one of the CNI scholars during that time was Nur Miswari. So Nur Miswari was among the students who formed the Moro National Liberation Front. So in 1971, the MNLF was first formed, but in its formation, ang original intention is not for armed struggle. However, during the declaration of martial law in 1972, Nur Miswari also resorted to armed struggle. And by 1976, so there was war no, from 1972 to 1976, the war was a stalemate, stalemate, and Marcos initiated a diplomatic solution to the problem. Bakit umabot sa stalemate? So during that time, Nur Miswari, who is also a charismatic leader, was able to recruit a huge army for the resistance. During that time, three-fourths of the whole Philippine army was stationed in the Bangsamoro region. And wars are very costly for Marcos politically and economically. Politically in the sense that Marcos during that time already received threats and sanctions from oil-producing countries in the Middle East. Na kung hindi matapos yung gulo doon sa Mindanao, na kung hindi mapagbigyan yung gusto ng mga Muslim in Mindanao, these countries in Middle East would cease to export oil to the Philippines. And also the United Nations during that time is also pressuring Ferdinand Marcos. And also economically, grabe, magastos talaga yung gera. So what happened is that they came into the agreement known as the Tripoli Agreement. So next slide, please. So Tripoli Agreement. So in 1976, representatives from the Philippine government and the MNLF met in Tripoli, Libya to discuss the possibilities of peace in Muslim Mindanao. So the said meeting provided the general principles for Muslim economy in the Philippine South and the establishment of autonomy in southern Philippines within the realm of sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Republic of the Philippines. However, Marcos is said to be hesitant of the Tripoli Agreement. Hesitant in the sense that he only used the Tripoli Agreement as a facade, for him to have a breathing space after those sanctions, after those economic downfalls brought about by the Moro rebellion in the south. So what happened? The Tripoli Agreement, including the ceasefire that was agreed between the two sides, only lasted for 9 months. And the fighting resumed in Mindanao, but hindi na ganyan ka-intense compared to the 1976 initial rebellion of the Muslims in Mindanao. So next slide, please. So after the Tripoli Agreement, so merong lag time, wala masyado nangyari, and then came EDSA Revolution. So the next phase of development in terms of pushing for an autonomous region in Mindanao was resumed during the time of Cory Aquino. So the drafting of the 1987 Constitution gave fresh hopes of the implementation of the Tripoli Agreement, and peace talks resumed under the new administration. So by 1989, the Philippine Congress voted for the creation of an autonomous region in Mindanao, so RA 6734, with the requirement of a ratification by a plebiscite in each of the 13 provinces and 9 cities included in the original autonomous areas described in the Tripoli Agreement. However, it became shaky because during the plebiscite, during the election process, only 4 out of the 13 or 14 provinces voted to be included in this
new autonomous region. And 0 out of 9 cities that was originally included during the Tripoli Agreement voted to be included. So wala talagang gustong pumasok sa proposed na ARMM during that time. However, by 1990s, gipush pa rin ang establishment of the ARMM. And Cotabato City was designated as its capital city. So next slide, please. So after the term of Cory Aquino, si Ramos na naman ang pumalit. So since he is a military person, so he has the knowledge, or he has the background or the wisdom how to deal with the Moro rebels during that time. So by 1993 to 1996, a series of peace talks with Nur Miswari happened, but became shaky towards the end of his administration. And fast forward in 2001, the Republic Act 9054 was passed by the Congress to expand the power and territory of ARMM. However, the law was passed without the signature of Gloria Arroyo. So basically, since wala itong pirma ng presidente, wala pa rin nangyari with Republic Act 9054. However, fast forward sa 2008, Hermogenes Esperon, peace advisor of Arroyo during that time, talked with the MILF leadership and agreed to add another 712 villages to the ARMM, as well as additional political and economic power to the MILF leadership. And this agreement was known as the Memorandum of Agreement on Ancestral Domain. Next slide, please. However, the problem with the MOA 80, marami ang nag-object nito since it is unconstitutional. So by the end of the Arroyo administration, pumalit na naman si Aquino. And during the time of Aquino, there were two landmark agreements made between the Philippine government and the MILF leadership. So the first one was the Framework Agreement on the Bangsamoro, or the FAB, which was signed on 2012. So basically, ang content ng FAB is that they would have to frame, or they have to create another autonomous region that would replace the existing ARMM that time, and the Comprehensive Agreement on the Bangsamoro, or the CAB, which was signed on 2014. And by 2012, Aquino announced his intention to establish an autonomous region in Mindanao and drafted the Bangsamoro Basic Law. However, matagal itong napasa into law because of the Mama Sapano encounter. So that was the setback during the time of Aquino. So next slide, please. So Duterte administration. So during the Duterte administration, a new draft for the BBL was created and was passed into law as the Bangsamoro Organic Law, or BOL, on 2018. And this new draft was drafted first in 2016. However, matagal pa rin ito napasa into law because of another incident that happened during that time, the Marawi siege. And then after it was passed into a law, a plebiscite was held to ratify the BOL, and it met disapprovals along the way. So Cotabato voted for the inclusion to BARMM, while Isabela City in Lamitan voted against the inclusion. So even Sulu also voted against the inclusion, with the governor challenging for its constitutionality, but walang magawa ang governor ng Sulu that time. They were included in the Bangsamoro region. So another plebiscite was held in Lanao del Norte and in some towns in North Cotabato. So as of today, there are still developments in terms of the implementation of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, and we still have to see kung ano ba talaga yung gagawin ni Marcos in the next few weeks, few months, or a few years. So basically, that is the history of the Bangsamoro in a nutshell. So we only have Uh, a few minutes left for question and answer portion, and after that, we can proceed to the next topic for this morning to be given to us by Sir Louis Olivero. So, if you have questions or clarifications about the presentation, you are free to ask. And if you wanted to have additional readings or kung saan ko kinuha yung mga sources ko, so I also included a source list of references in the PowerPoint presentation. So I already forwarded it to Sir Louis for your reference. So once again, thank you so much and good morning.
Thank you very much, Josh. No, so, sige, let's open the floor for questions. Maybe 2 or 3 questions we can accommodate. Clear po ba? Mas naintindihan ba natin, no, kung ano yung context ng mga conflicts dito sa Mindanao, especially dito sa areas ng BARMM?
So the Bangsamoro history is an interesting topic sa totoo lang, but given our short time, so we have to condense everything in just an hour and a half. And if you want to have a more broad understanding of Bangsamoro history, you may want to join the Madaris Volunteer Program as full-time volunteers for the next school year. So magandang experience nito. So hindi lamang in theory ang alam natin sa history ng Bangsamoro, but you will have a first-hand experience of the life situation and history of Bangsamoro sa assigned areas ninyo in the near future.
Sige po. Any questions from the group? Kanina hindi masyadong na-run through ni Josh, no, yung iba't ibang different groups that were talks with the government. Alam po ba ng lahat kung ano ang pinagkaiba ng MNLF, ng MILF, BIFF? Sige, alam po ba or may gusto mag-share kung ano ang kanilang understanding of the 3 Moro groups?
So very interesting yung topic about MILF, MNLF. Kasi yan yung nakikita, naririnig natin sa news. And sometimes we do not have an idea kung ano po sila. We just hear about them. No? So it's good to hear from our participants kung ano yung idea nila when we mention the word MILF, MNLF, BIAF, BIFF, may ASG, so on and so forth. Marami yan.
True. So, and lalo na sa mga taga Luzon, no? Kasi for us, people from Luzon, majority of the news that we know about Mindanao is really more on the conflicts. No, kasi ako, honestly, when I went to Mindanao, all I know about Mindanao are the conflicts, especially in ARM, no? So, and madalas ang nasa news lang yan is the MILF, and then there's a clash with MNLF, and then biglang may lumabas na naman na bagong groups, which is the BIFF. Sige, meron ba? How about magtawag ako from the group, ha? Although you can refuse to answer or sabihin nyo lang kung hindi pa masyadong familiar. How about Ardos? Any idea lang kung anong differences ng tatlo?
Actually, familiar lang ako dun sa yung pangalan nila, but the difference ng goals ng mga yon, kung bakit sila nabuo, hindi po talaga rin ako ganun ka-familiar. Kaya, wala akong masasabi tungkol dun sa differences ng mga groups and ano yung mga significant involvement sila sa history ng Philippines. I have no idea. Sorry.
Sige, Josh, you may want to elaborate on the differences.
Okay, the MNLF and MILF first, no? So before we try to distinguish what are the two, no? So it is important to note that these two groups are recognized by the international community. So they also have international support and funding, and of course recognition. No? So they don't qualify to be called as terrorists. So clarification natin yan, ha? So they are called rebels, insurgents. So they have a ideology, they have a government that they want to push. So in a way, recognized talaga yan sila. So MNLF was established by Nur Miswari in 1971. So basically, the aim of the MNLF was to push for a self autonomy in, well, the present day ARMM. So kasali na pala sana yung Palawan, dyan na areas. And then, ang MILF naman was first formed after the collapse of the Tripoli Agreement. So there were dissatisfactions within the MNLF leadership about sa components or sa mga details about the Tripoli Agreement. So Hashim Salamat created the MILF. So kung ang MNLF was stationed majority in the island provinces, so the MILF on the other hand was focused more on mainland Mindanao. So the differences is that different leaderships, different different structures, but the goal is the same, no, is to push for a autonomous region, or, well, the freedom yun talaga ng Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan. So for the BIAF and BIFF, so Sir Rui, I think you would be in the position to describe those, especially na sa Maguindanao ka na assigned before.
Sige na. So, I'll build up lang from dun sa discussion ni Josh. So, di ba, pinakaunang nabuo ang MNLF. So, it was formed by Nur Miswari and isang group lang talaga sila before. No, and then Josh mentioned that after some internal conflicts because of the kumbaga, may say lackluster or incomplete na implementation of the Tripoli Agreement, hindi may internal conflict na nabuo between the leaderships. And also geographically, kasi nga, the MNLF are more situated in the island provinces. And and then I think also with the leadership, with the form ARMM that time, and it actually subsequently failed din because of the corruption that happened within the ARMM government itself. So by the time na nagkakagulo na sila, no, so MILF was formed by Hashim Salamat. Sila naman, they are more situated sa Maguindanao. Also one of the problems that ARMM encountered since nag-separate si MILF, which is mas malaki in terms of numbers kasi and in terms of geographical location. Kasi mas andun sila sa mainland, they are more scattered in the Maguindanao province and in Lanao, no? So and then afterwards, MILF was actually the ones who had the peace talks with the Philippine government again, for the BARMM. No, so ibang groups na ulit yung na kumbaga nag-head ng peace talks between the GPH and the armed groups. So eventually ngayon sila yung nabuo. And then may ilan pa rin na hindi happy with the BARMM, no? Meron pa rin groups who wanted full autonomy or full separation from the Philippines. So diyan na nabuo si BIFF, which is the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, na situated pa rin sila more on sa may area ng SPMS box in Maguindanao. So, SPMS box just means that to ayan. Basta yung area sa may datu na they call it SPMS box. It's an initials, ang S ay Datu Saudi ang patuan, P is Pagatin, Sharif, anong pangaba? Sharif Aguaca, and may isa pa. Basta yung area dyan na andyan ang parang core ng conflict, No? So they call it SPMS box kasi dyan yung areas, box siya talaga. And majority andyan ang, pero as far as I know, medyo nasa subjugate na ang BIFF kasi in the recent past, they also acquainted themselves with the ISIS group. So they pledged their allegiance um, to extremist forces. So but basically yun yung kumbaga major difference between the MILF, the MNLF, and the BIFF. So currently, it's the MILF who has been working with the government. The chief minister of BARMM ngayon is the the head of the MILF before, and then Nur Miswari is still considered as the wali. The wali or siya pa rin ba ngayon, Josh?
Na pa rin ngayon.
Pa rin, the wali is more on a ceremony
Ceremonial.
na leader. No, but it's mas ceremonial function niya. But in terms of running the Bangsamoro government, it lies with the chief minister. Is sino nga ba? Si Iqbal, yung isa. Sino ka minister ng BARMM? Okay.
Actually, in addition sa sinabi ni Sir Rui kanina the government has to talk with MILF and MNLF during the peace process. So in fairness kay President Duterte before, when he proposed a federal system of government in the Philippines, in order to appease both sides, so Duterte wanted to establish two federal states in present-day BARMM. So the first one would be situated in the island provinces, which would be given to the MNLF leadership, and number two, one in mainland Mindanao, which will be given to the MILF leadership. Because according to Duterte, well, in fairness sa kanya, nasabi niya to ng tama, magkaiba talaga yung culture and then practices na mainland compared to the island. So that was the positive thing na nakita ko during the proposed federal government in the Philippines. So we also have a question here in the chat box. So supportado ba ng BIFF, BOL or ang peace process? So before we answer that question, also the context first. So the BIFF closely associated themselves with the Islamic State. So basically, they tried to adopt certain ideologies and ideas of the Islamic State, and one of which is to establish an independent Muslim state in the country. So not only an autonomous region, but a separate country here in Mindanao and Sulu. So to answer your question, so the BIFF are hesitant or does not agree with the BOL or the peace process, because in the peace process of the BOL, proposed lang man ito is that the Philippine government would give an autonomous region in Mindanao, not a separate entity or a separate country in Mindanao and Sulu.
And it's actually the peace talks that started the breakout of the BIFF from the MILF. Because yes, they want a different thing of compared to the one na dinidiscuss during the peace talks. Sige, any more questions or insights? Sige na. So, okay na tayo. Thank you very much, Josh, for that insightful discussion. Medyo maliit yung oras natin for the discussion of the whole Bangsamoro history, but at least I think it gives a fundamental foundation on the history of BARMM and in connection with what the Madaris Volunteer Program is doing. So this is very important since ito yung mga tao and areas that we are engaged with. So we need to identify or at least have this foundation on ano yung history and pinagdaanan nila throughout the years that has been, lalo na in the context of the Philippine history. As of now, hanggang ngayon, hindi pa rin ito tinuturo into our mainstream education. I think BARMM is trying to come up with a curriculum that will include the Bangsamoro history. And I think they're also trying to lobby with the Department of Education to really include not just the mainstream history of the Philippines, which is mostly in Luzon history, no? So na mas magkaroon siguro ng holistic historical view and perspective ng Philippines, which includes the Visayan and the Mindanao history.